I'm Sheyevkovich from the University of Waterloo, and it is my pleasure to start us off all with the first of 4 sessions of the CEWIL Canada Research Series. I would like to acknowledge that the land on which I am meeting with you today is the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders, past and present. I also acknowledge that as we come together today, while staying apart, we may be gathering on other traditional lands from around the world. I acknowledge the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge, laws, and philosophies of the Indigenous people with whom we all share these lands today. With me today are co-organizers Rachel Braun from the University of Calgary and Dana Church from the University of Waterloo. We are all members of CEWIL Canada's Research Committee. A warm welcome to all our attendees. As we start our session, may I please encourage everyone on the call to share their name and institution in the chat. You're also very welcome to include your own land acknowledgement. It would be nice to know which of our colleagues have joined us today. A big thank you to the members of the CEWIL Canada Research Committee for their time invested in the peer review process by which these papers were shortlisted for the cancelled CEWIL Canada Conference Research Track. A few notes about the Zoom platform, please. If you wish to view the speaker and the slides, switch to speaker view from an icon at the top of your screen and select side-by-side view. If you'd like to save the chat thread, click on the bottom right corner of that window to save the chat thread. If you happen to experience any tech issues, please place those in the chat as well. Our tech colleagues are standing by to help you. If you run into tech challenges later, your best bet is to leave the call and join again. We hope to have time for a few brief questions at the end of every presentation. Please use the Q&A feature from the bottom of your screen to submit these. You may address the question to the appropriate person or to all the panelists, and I will moderate the questions at the end of each presentation. Let's kick off the CEWIL Canada Research Series with a few words on advancing will research from Ashley Sterling from the University of Toronto, who is the current chair of the Research Committee. Over to you, Ashley.
Hello, everyone. Just bear with me while I pull up my slides here. Okay, a very warm welcome to the inaugural Co-op Education and Work Integrated Learning Research Seminar Series. It's terrific that we have such a great turnout for our first event, and I hope that you'll be able to join us for all 4. I also want to start by acknowledging and thanking those organizers of this webinar series, Rachel Braun from the University of Calgary, Dana Church from the University of Waterloo, and Shabnam Ikovic, I practiced that, also from the University of Waterloo. I also want to acknowledge the contributions of Heather Skanes from the Memorial University for her contributions to the original compilation and review of all the research papers that you're going to see presented, as well as the other members of the CEWIL Research Committee for the ideation, development, and initiation really of this idea and getting us to this point where we're going to have this series to offer you. I want to start by talking about some of the priorities for the CEWIL Research Committee. And those include developing and supporting a community of Canadian work integrated learning researchers, and increasing the profile of CEWIL research throughout a variety of communication channels, both locally, nationally, and internationally. In support of these initiatives, in addition to this CEWIL research webinar series, I want to drop a shameless plug for some of the other initiatives of the CEWIL Research Committee that will be ongoing over the 2020 to 2021 academic year. So in addition to this webinar series, we are offering a special issue, call for expressions of interest to submit research to be published in a special issue of the International Journal of Work Integrated Learning. And this special issue will be on the practice and research of co-op education and work integrated learning in the Canadian context. I'm just going to flip now to the comments section, into the chat, and I will paste information specifically on that special issue there for those of you that are interested. It'd be great to have your submissions. I'm also pleased to share that we will continue to offer CEWIL research grants, and more details and a call for applications will be coming out in spring 2021. So I do think it's important to also talk about work integrated learning, research, and the COVID context. This year is like no other, and it's important to acknowledge the tremendous work and innovation of the entire CEWIL community in transforming and redesigning high-quality co-op education and work integrated learning in the current COVID context, as well as the resilience and adaptability of coordinators, students, and employers and supervisors alike. With this, it's also important to note that there are ongoing challenges, questions, and new considerations, in addition to a wealth of opportunity that's coming out in this field. Many of you have already transformed your co-op and work integrated learning programs and may already be actively planning ahead to future terms and future years. In this period of transformation, it's critical that we are making empirically informed decisions and develop a knowledge base to inform both current and future pedagogical advancements in our field. In thinking about higher education, teaching and learning more broadly, there are several issues that require deliberate and thoughtful attention, both immediately and over time. This includes working towards anti-oppressive, equitable, and inclusive teaching, learning, and practice, decolonizing curriculum, addressing issues and opportunities of internationalization, supporting student mental health, preparing students for careers in rapidly changing industries and in fields with rapidly changing and evolving knowledges, demands, and required skill sets, and also rethinking teaching and learning pedagogies, policies, and processes, including the practice of work integrated learning and working and learning remotely. Each of these questions requires focused attention and research across Canadian higher education, as well as within the specific practice of co-op and work integrated learning. There has been tremendous change and innovation over a short period of time, and the entire CEWIL community should be commended for the individual and collective contributions to this progress. Of note, especially to this webinar series and the CEWIL Research Committee, is the excellent body of research that is building in the field of work integrated learning in Canada. So I fully expect that I'm speaking to a converted audience here, but I think it's important for us to start this webinar series with the question of what is the value of research? And so I turn it out to the group first. So feel free to use the chat and let me know what you believe is the value of research, and specifically, why do we need research in the field of co-op education and work integrated learning? Flipping over and looking to see some of the comments coming up. To measure existing practices, continuous process and improvement, capture learning in a systemic way, leads to advancement, meeting the needs of stakeholders. Terrific, absolutely. So when we talk about the value of research, some of the things that come up regularly, as we're seeing here in the comments, research is exploratory, it's explanatory, it can be descriptive, has helped us to understand what is happening. What's exciting about research is that it's often action-oriented, it leads to innovation, it inspires change, progress, and growth. And all of these are reasons that can sum up some of the terrific outputs of research and some of the answers that we glean from the research that we conduct. I also want to say, though, that while these reasons are indeed very important, extremely influential, and why we need to be investing more in research in the fields of co-op education and work integrated learning, I actually propose that one of the greatest values of research is the research process itself and the questions that are generated. So when we actually talk about what is quality research is critical, it's reflexive, it leads to more questions and different ways of thinking. It encourages us to test new ideas, try new things, and importantly, to collaborate and work together to ask questions about our work that have not been asked before. I note that there's a direct parallel between this and some of the recognized elements for effective learning and development in work integrated learning itself. I'm going to flip off the screen here. So as a part of this 4-part series, you're going to hear some terrific research presentations that are occurring across our country. Really a huge thanks to the presenters who have agreed to share their research, and to each of you for attending and participating as a member of the CEWIL research community. I hope the research presentations spark new ideas for you, encourage you to try new things, and importantly, that you leave with questions that you hadn't considered beforehand and that you may personally address in your own research. And with that, with no further ado, I'm going to turn it back to Shay to introduce our first presenter. Thanks.
Thank you, Ashley, for setting the stage to what we hope will be an inspiring and invigorating experience for all of us. Our first paper is presented by a trio from the University of Waterloo, Dana Church, David Drury, and Judine Pretty. They will share the 6 actions or talents discovered through their research that seem most important for student success in the workplace of the future. Their paper is Validation of a Talent Framework for Work Integrated Learning Students. Over to you, Dana.
Great, thank you, Shay. I'll just share my screen. Okay, well, welcome to the webinar. My name is Dana Church, and I am the Manager of Research of the Work Learn Institute at the University of Waterloo. Today, I'll be presenting the work we have done so far on our Future Ready Talent Framework. First, I'll give a bit of background about our project. At the University of Waterloo, as you may know, we have a large cooperative education program where each semester thousands of students apply competitively for jobs. These jobs are 4 or 8 month-long work terms with an employer. Students alternate between school terms where they are taking classes and work terms. Like many of you, we have realized that the labor market students and graduates are entering these days is quite different from what it used to be, and it continues to change at a rapid speed. Students and graduates are facing what has been called Industry 4.0, or the Fourth Industrial Revolution. This refers to the fact that the workplace is being transformed by technological advances such as artificial intelligence, automation, and robots. The labor market has also seen an uptick in what are called gigs or freelance work. Instead of holding a permanent position at an organization, many people work from contract to contract or project to project, piecing together freelance work to make a living. These days, it is quite rare for employees to remain at one organization for the total of their working life. And finally, we recognize that students and graduates face what we call a VUCA world, a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Challenges that impact the labor market include climate change, globalization, shifting economic and political landscapes, aging populations, social and economic divides, and most recently, pandemics. Our question is, how can we prepare our co-op students and graduates for the future of work? We decided that a good place to start would be to design a competency framework that would outline the skills, knowledge, and behaviors students would need to succeed in the future workplace. We call this our Future Ready Talent Framework. One other purpose of our Future Ready Talent Framework is to provide a consistent language in the various ways we interact with students and employers across our cooperative and experiential education portfolio at the University of Waterloo. The term competencies and talents are used interchangeably, and for our work, we've decided to use the word talent, as it aligns with the language used in industry and, for our purposes, better represents the collective set of skills, knowledge, attributes, and behaviors that will be critical for success in the future workplace. The Future Ready Talent Framework is essentially a future-focused competency framework. Our first step in developing our framework was to identify existing competency frameworks relevant for the post-secondary and employment sectors. We identified 54 frameworks to analyze. These lists of competencies included sources such as the undergraduate degree level expectations from the Council of Ontario Universities, the Canadian Engineering Accreditation Board graduate outcomes, as well as international organizations such as the World Economic Forum. Among those 54 frameworks, there were 30 distinct competencies. Through an analysis of which competencies appeared most frequently, we found that there were 9 competencies that were referenced in more than half of those 54 frameworks. Then we examined those sets of competencies in light of the literature related to the future of work and in light of the Waterloo WIL context. We arrived at a set of 12 talents that grouped together within 4 main clusters. This is a snapshot of the analysis we did with the 54 frameworks to end up with our 12 talents. Along the left-hand side are listed all the talents or competencies that appeared in the frameworks. There were 30 in total, and not all of them are shown here. Then across the top are each of the 54 frameworks. Again, not all are shown here. A check mark was placed under the framework if it contained the competency in a particular row. This process allowed us to see which competencies occurred most frequently across frameworks. And here is the result of our work, the Future Ready Talent Framework. There are 12 competencies or talents arranged in 4 main clusters. The 4 clusters are expand and transfer expertise, develop self, build relationships, and design and deliver solutions. Under expand and transfer expertise, we have discipline and context-specific skills, information and data literacy, and technological agility. Under develop self, we have self-management, self-assessment, and lifelong learning and career development. Build relationships includes communication, collaboration, and intercultural effectiveness. And finally, design and deliver solutions involves innovation mindset, critical thinking, and implementation. We have a website devoted to the Future Ready Talent Framework, and the link is on the slide below the framework. For the next step in the development of our framework, we realized we need observable, measurable behaviors for each of the 12 talents. For example, what does it mean for a student to show self-management? What does it mean to have an innovation mindset? So what we did next was ask a group of students, a group of staff and faculty, and a group of co-op employers to provide behaviors that come to mind when they think of each of the 12 talents. They provided us with around 1,800 examples, or an average of 41 behaviors per talent. 41 behaviors per talent is way too high a number, especially if we are thinking of developing some kind of evaluation tool down the road. So we had to shorten this list of behaviors. To shorten the list, we created a working group of 3 staff members involved in the Cooperative Education Program and 3 researchers from our Work-Learn Institute. First, we eliminated repeated behaviors, and then we made sure that behaviors only occurred once for one of the 12 talents. In other words, one behavior could not be included in more than one talent. The result of this exercise was a much shorter list of 59 behaviors, but still, this is a long list. We asked whether we could shorten the list even further. So to narrow down the list of 59 behaviors, we developed a survey that we gave to WIL practitioners. In the survey, we presented the behaviors and asked them to sort them into the 12 different talents. 10 of the behaviors were sorted incorrectly, so we were left with a list of 49 behaviors. When we say they were sorted incorrectly, we mean that they were sorted into a talent different from the talent we expected it to be sorted into, or more commonly, they were sorted into more than one talent. This could mean that these behaviors are not clear indicators of the talent or that they could apply to more than one talent. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are inconsistent with talent. For the next step in our validation process, we administered an online survey to co-op employers who had supervised a student in the previous year. For each of the 49 behaviors, we asked the supervisors to rate the student on a 5-point scale to measure how work-ready the student was in terms of that behavior. They were to think of the student's performance relative to an entry-level employee. The scale they rated them on ranged from -2, not yet ready, -1, almost ready, 0, ready, +1, ready for more, and +2, ready for much more. Here is the Future Ready Talent Framework showing the 12 talents and the overall results of the supervisor's ratings. Overall, for each of the 12 talents, ratings tended to cluster around the middle of the 5-point scale, which indicates that supervisors tended to rate that their students were ready for an entry-level role typical of a university graduate for each of the 12 talents. We also asked supervisors to rate the co-op student they had in mind in terms of 8 additional questions. These were, did the student make a positive contribution to the team? Did the student make a transformative contribution? Did the student make a significant contribution? Did the employer feel that they received a return on investment in hiring the student? Did the employer enjoy having the student on their team? Would the employer recommend the student to a colleague? Would the employer offer a full-time position to the student if one were available? And finally, we asked about the student's overall performance. Using stepwise regression, we discovered that 10 of the behaviors in the Future Ready Talent Framework were significant predictors of at least 2 out of the 8 outcome variables that I just showed you. On this slide, on the left-hand side are the 10 behaviors that predicted 2 or more of the 8 outcome variables. On the right are the talent clusters that the behaviors belong to. As you can see, 3 of the behaviors come from the category of lifelong learning and career development. 2 are from communication, and 1 each for implementation, self-assessment, collaboration, self-management, and context-specific knowledge and skills. So here's a summary of what I have presented on the development of our Future Ready Talent Framework. We started off with an analysis of 54 existing competency frameworks. From this analysis, we identified 12 key talents. Over 60 CEWIL stakeholders provided behaviors that represented each of the 12 talents. Over 60 participants helped us validate the talents in our framework. And finally, over 900 employers of University of Waterloo co-op students helped us to further validate the behavioral statements in our framework, which in future could be used as items for student evaluation. In terms of conclusions, we first want to highlight that there is very little discussion in the literature about how competency frameworks are actually developed. We provide transparency about how we developed and validated our Future Ready Talent Framework. Second, we will be using our Future Ready Talent Framework to help prepare co-op students at the University of Waterloo for the current and future workplace. Some of the ways we will use the framework include designing course content and workshops for students, using the framework as a tool for student advisors who do site visits and who can then identify opportunities for student talent development, and incorporating the Future Ready Talent Framework into employers' student performance evaluations and their job postings. Finally, future research can also explore how our Future Ready Talent Framework can be applied to other forms of WIL besides co-op. And with that, I thank you, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much, Dana, for an excellent presentation. The floor is now open for questions, and at the bottom of your Zoom screen, on the black bar, there's an option called Q&A. Please use that for any questions you might have. So Dana, while we wait for everybody to take your presentation in a little bit, could you talk to us as to how you plan to integrate the talent framework into the co-op process at the university?
Oh, good question. So there's several ways that we've been thinking of incorporating it. One is, I guess, at the beginning of the co-op students' journey is with job postings. So it can be used to help employers craft job postings that use potentially a specific language that speaks to the Future Ready Talent Framework. And also courses for students. So we have a number of professional development courses that co-op students participate in. And we can have courses that focus on maybe a particular talent, how to develop their talents. So professional development courses for sure are one area that we can incorporate the framework. And then also student performance evaluations for employers. It can help students realize their strengths and what talents maybe they can work on in the future. So there's a number of different points in the co-op journey that we can see the Future Ready Talent Framework being quite useful.
Thank you, Dana. I see we have two questions here. The first is, would you be able to give us a couple of example behaviors for each of the clusters?
Ah, okay. Let me just pull up just go back to my screen here. Okay, so maybe I'll go back. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. I'll go back to the slide I had. Oops. Sorry about this. I'm getting some, it's not letting me go back. Okay, so I'll just read it off of another screen that I have open. Sorry about that. So for lifelong learning and career development, one sample behavior is makes plans to achieve learning goals. For implementation, one is manages their own deadlines. For communication, could be communicates ideas effectively. Self-assessment is learns from mistakes. Collaboration does a fair share of the team's work. Self-management copes with workplace pressures. And context-specific knowledge and skills, an example is develops knowledge and skills relevant to the specific work context. So for each of the 12 talents, we have several behaviors. I think it's between 3 and 4 different behaviors, and that we believe that employers can observe and evaluate the students on. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Dana. And just for everybody, the papers and the presentations will be made available to all registrants once the series is all done. So you will have the deeper level detail to the papers as well. We have time for a few more questions, Dana, if you're up for it. The next one is, could you please comment on whether or how you see the talent framework applying across all degree levels, undergrad, master's, doctoral?
Oh, that's a great question. So at the moment, we've had undergraduate students in mind, but we think that there's quite a lot of potential to extend the Future Ready Talent Framework to graduate studies as well. So hopefully that will be an area of research that we can pursue in the near future to apply it to graduate students as well.
Thank you. And then the last one here for now, how is this competency framework being incorporated into the co-op prep coursework at U Waterloo, if at all? And if so, what learning objectives do you have that align with behaviors outlined in the framework?
Okay, good question. So yes, we are in the midst of incorporating this framework into the prep courses for co-op students. For now, introducing the students to the framework, making them aware of it and the different talents to get them thinking about, what are their strengths? What might they want to work on during their university and co-op career? So for now, it's an introduction, and we will be further developing course content to more specifically speak to the Future Ready Talent Framework in future.
Thank you. Do you see this being adopted in particular departments first?
Well, we've had some volunteering, some faculties have volunteered to have us sort of pilot how the Future Ready Talent Framework can map onto their course content. So we're in the midst of trying that out, to seeing how it can map onto learning outcomes and assessment in various courses. So hopefully it can be applied and useful for different faculties. We see it as quite applicable across different faculties, but yes, further research will give us more insight on that.
Thank you. And the last question before we move on to our next presentation: how does the talent framework incorporate cultural perspectives and cultural competency?
Oh, excellent. So we do have a specific talent devoted to intercultural effectiveness, and the behaviors that we have incorporated in there speak to that, speak to diversity and how individuals are sensitive and respectful towards different differences amongst people. So we made a point, and not a lot of frameworks actually, when we did our analysis, did include that. And when we met as a group to finalize the framework, we felt that that was quite a need, that we had to have something that spoke to diversity and culture in the framework.
Thank you very much, Dana.
You're welcome.
We'll move us along to the next presentation. We have Judine Pretty from the University of Waterloo, who will now present her work on how the co-op experience can be designed to enable both students and employers to maximize benefits for the organization and the students, and to minimize costs for the organization as well. Her paper is Examining the Work in Work Integrated Learning. Over to you, Judine.
Okay.
Thanks, Shay. I am going to thank Dana in advance for being willing to share slides and advance them as we go through the presentation. We'll just take a minute to get those up.
Just a minute. Sorry about this.
Great. Perfect. Thanks, Dana. Thank you to everyone who has joined us today. I am very pleased to have this opportunity to share with you this piece of research. It's actually a portion of the data that I collected as part of my PhD dissertation last year. And I have quite a bit that I'd like to share with you, so I'm going to jump right in. If you have any questions about information that I share, if I'm going too quickly and you'd like to learn more, please reach out. So for those of you who have been involved with co-op or work integrated learning programs for some time, you'll likely be aware that there's quite a bit of research that supports the outcomes that students gain through participation in co-op or work integrated learning programs. Often those are grouped according to academic related outcomes, professional related outcomes, or personal related outcomes. But as well, there's also research that highlights outcomes for employers. So thinking of the benefits to employers of participating in co-op or work integrated learning as an opportunity for a short-term flexible labor source. Also bringing in creativity and ideas to the organization. As well, research that explores employers and their use of co-op and WIL to fill talent pipelines. So what I found in the literature, though, was there was little discussion about how the work that was given to students during their WIL experiences contributed to those benefits or outcomes. I'm going to oversimplify the situation for a moment to have you help you appreciate the dynamic that I wanted to investigate. So when we think about both the employer and the student perspective on the work term, there's a potential for tension. So that is from the student perspective. While they obviously want to contribute to the organization that they're part of, they also want to learn new things. They don't want to be given work that they see as easy or menial. They want to stretch. Flipping it around and looking at it from the organization or the employer's perspective, they have new students potentially coming in every 4 months, 6 months, depending on the cycles. And if the work that they give the student isn't straightforward, it means that they need to spend time training and supporting each new group of students as they come in, which one could think of as a cost in terms of organizational productivity. So it's this tension that led to the development of my research question, and that is sort of how do the tasks or the work given to students create a win-win such that both the organization and the students benefit. So I won't go too much in depth into the literature review, but highlight that while there were no studies that I found that examined the characteristics of work in relation to the outcomes that I mentioned, there was literature that provided a foundation for me on how I could approach the study of the work assigned to students. And two key contributions that I would highlight are Hackman and Oldham's job characteristics model, as well as a model of work experience in WIL proposed by Pat Rowe, which was an adaptation of the work of Tesla and Jacobs in Quinones, Ford, and Teach Out. So these two pieces of work in particular gave me a framework to consider the dimensions that I wanted to examine in investigating the work done by students during WIL experiences. So the approach that I took to conducting this research was a case study. I was able to identify an organization that hires more than 100 co-op students a year that was interested in participating in the study. I followed a mixed methods approach, collecting data through interviews and then a survey with students and supervisors. I conducted 10 in-depth interviews with students. They were most of them were almost 2 hours in length, so it was quite an in-depth description, and was followed by a survey that I did with students in 2 subsequent cohorts, but also working for the same organization. It was important for the research question that I was studying to really dig deeply into what the experience was for the students and how understand the organizational context in which work was being assigned. I conducted thematic analysis of the transcripts and used statistical techniques with the quantitative data that I collected. So now I'll share with you 4 main findings from this portion of the research. I asked students in the interviews to describe 3 main tasks that they'd worked on during their work terms. And for each of those tasks, I asked the student who they'd interacted with in order to do the task, as well as a set of questions related to the dimensions of the task. I did a factor analysis on the dimensions that students provided ratings for, and found that those ratings clustered in 2 main areas. And I labeled those complexity and the criticality of the task. So the complexity of the task was related to students' perception of the difficulty of the task, how long it took them to feel comfortable in doing it, how much training they were provided, and how much flexibility there was in how the student went about completing the task. Criticality was related to students' perception of how important the task was to their organization, how much pressure they felt in getting the task done, how much of a problem it would have been if they had made an error. So the risk to the organization in giving them that task. And then lastly, I asked them who would have done the task if it wasn't for the student doing it, and would it have been done in the same time frame as the student was completing it. When I look at the data in terms of these two dimensions, criticality and complexity, and mapped out the tasks that students reported on, this is what I found. So the majority of the tasks were reported as moderate in terms of both complexity and criticality, with criticality ratings being skewed slightly higher. So the work that students felt the work needed to be done, and complexity skewed slightly downwards. So on average, tasks were at or below what the students perceived their level to be. The next finding I will share is that I combined the ratings that students had given for those 3 tasks and looked at how that aggregated complexity and criticality connected to the work term outcomes that students reported on, such as reports of learning, whether the students felt that this experience matched what they expected, whether they felt they were treated like a regular employee of the organization, and what they perceived as the long-term investment of having had this work experience. You'll see here in the chart that overall complexity and criticality of their roles fell around the midpoint of the scale, with the outcome dimensions scoring higher. What was interesting is the correlations. You'll see in red that as the complexity ratings increased, students were more likely to report higher levels of learning, that the experience matched their expectations, and that they had a higher perception of long-term investment. So complexity was connected to those 3 outcomes highlighted in red, and criticality was connected to whether they felt like they were treated like a full-time employee. That is, as the task was reported to have higher levels of criticality, more students felt that they were treated as a regular member of the organization. Sorry, the students' rating was higher for whether they felt they had been treated like a regular employee. The last finding I'll share with you today is what emerged when I stepped back and looked at the patterns in the collection of tasks assigned to students. What I found for this particular organization was that there were 3 main types of tasks given to students. I labeled those as highlight project, engineering support tasks, and side projects. There were some interesting distinctions in the characteristics of these 3 types of tasks. The highlight project was something that each student had, and there was an organizational approach to problem solving that the students learned and applied to the project. Students felt ownership for this project, and they felt pressure to do a good job because at the end of the term, there was a presentation to senior leaders of the organization to present the findings of their highlight project. Because of the public nature of the presentation, the teams that worked with the students felt pressure to support the student in doing a good job because it would reflect poorly on their team if the student didn't. In terms of the characteristics associated with the highlight projects, the students reported this type of task had the highest amount of training and was the highest in terms of what it required of their capabilities. There was clearly a lot of learning that was happening for the students as a result of this project and the support that they received in completing it. The other 2 types of tasks I put under a label of ad hoc. These were more likely to emerge as the work term progressed and to be assigned to students when something came up. One of the types of tasks I labeled engineering support tasks. These were the most structured, least flexible tasks in terms of how the student should go about doing them. And there was the highest amount of risk reported if the student made a mistake or missed something. These were the tasks within the organization that needed to be done. And if the student wasn't there, one of the full-time members of the team would have needed to do it in the same time frame. The last type of tasks I labeled side projects. These were the ones assigned to the student, but wouldn't necessarily have been done, or at least done in the same time frame if the student wasn't there to do it. With that description, it's probably not too surprising to you that students reported the lowest level of pressure and risk associated with those types of tasks. And so what does all of this mean? I would suggest a few key takeaways from this research. One, I think that complexity and criticality of the work given to students seem to be valuable dimensions for us to consider as WIL researchers and practitioners. One of the reasons that I suggest that it may be valuable for us to consider this is because it seems to be connected to important outcomes, such as the degree of learning students reported, their perception of the return on investment, and whether they felt like they were treated like a real member of the organization. Another reason that looking at the work given to students through the lens of criticality and complexity may be interesting is that it may help us design roles which are a collection of tasks where the dimensions of criticality and complexity vary. For example, a combination of lower complexity, higher criticality may be possibly higher value for employers, versus higher complexity, lower criticality may result in higher value for students. And this may be a way to address the potential tension that I spoke about early in the presentation on how to create that win-win for both the student and the organization. I would be remiss if I didn't highlight that there is obviously more research that could be done in this area. This study was done with one organization, one faculty of students, one university, and one model of work integrated learning being co-op. So one could vary any of those specific dimensions of the study and look to see what might be learned as a result. And with that, I will pass it back to Shay.
Thank you so much, Jadine, for an excellent presentation. The floor is open for questions. Again, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should have a black bar, and one of the options there is Q&A. So type away, and while people are doing that typing, Jadine, I had a question for you.
Sure.
So one aspect of sustainability is also transition planning. So I'm wondering whether you have any advice or you've discovered best practices to help employers implement this delicate balance of criticality and complexity over and over and over again, because
Yes.
we do hope that once they bring co-op students into an organization, or any interns for that matter, that they would want to continue doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's a great question. So no question, when you think about that tension between the demands on the organization to bring in a student, get them up and ready, and so that they're a contributing member of the organization, there are definitely techniques that I've seen both in this study and in other studies that employers use. Probably many of you are familiar with how employers can take current students and help bridge into the next student, whether that's the ongoing maintenance of a manual or sort of a report out process at the end of the term where the one student's sort of passing it over the projects in their current state to the next student. We've certainly seen, it's not always logistically possible, but sometimes it can be that the previous student is still there in the first week of the next student. But wherever those bridges can be created, it lessens that burden on employers for the retraining. The other piece that we've seen being very effective and was the case in the organization I studied was often they have returning students. And so where they have returning or senior level students and have a strategy of bringing in junior students, it is a great experience for the senior student to provide mentorship to the junior student, and it also offsets that training requirement as well. In the case of these students, the junior ones reported how valuable it was to them to have that student that they felt comfortable asking questions. They weren't worried about looking dumb, and so it's a great way of creating that sustainable process such that that it maximizes the benefits for all.
Thank you. We do have a bunch of questions that have shown up. The first being, did you find that students and supervisors had similar ideas about what was critical and complex, or were there differences?
That's a great question. I I did have the benefit of having a few pairs within my sample where it happened to be the students who had worked with the specific supervisor that I had spoken with. So while I didn't have enough of them to include in my actual dissertation, I did see, I could hear it both through the interview with the supervisor and the student, how they were perceiving the same work. And I would say the ones that was the case, I did see that they had similar perceptions of it. The one difference I would say overall is supervisors tended to rate the criticality slightly less than what the students did. Now, I wouldn't have enough basis to say that they were reporting on the same task, so there's a big asterisk beside that. But for the most part, I think students perceived the risk to the organization as higher of the work they were doing than what the supervisors believed it was. I think the supervisors had confidence, having seen many students before do this kind of work, that they knew the student was quite capable of doing it, maybe even more than what the student thought.
Thank you. How can you imagine these insights could inform how we interface with employers at various stages? For example, posting a role for the first time, extending an existing student, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think probably collectively across the WIL landscape in Canada and maybe beyond, we probably have this notion of what a role might look like, but there isn't a lot written about it or that has been done in research. And so I really see this as a potential starting point to say the model that I've presented is one way that an organization does it. There could be many other examples, and if we had kind of a toolkit or a collection of these types of models, then it could help us from everything from job development and helping employers see what would fit with their organization and the needs that they're looking to fill, as well as through then the enrichment for the students. So when I shared back this data with the students I had participated in my study, they didn't have the model in their head. They didn't realize that even though they were in a group of 20 or 30 co-op students, that there was a common pattern to the jobs they had been given. And so I think even from that perspective, that might help them in seeking out opportunities in the workplaces for those higher complexity, maybe lower criticality type roles.
Thank you. Janine, I'm going to go to the chat for a minute because I see Sean has asked a second question and I don't want to miss this the second time again. So from the implications, would you recommend the increase of complexity and criticality in fostering more of a win-win relationship? And if so, what are some of the suggestions in building that into job postings?
Okay. So yes, I think complexity and criticality give a pretty simple way of thinking about how we can design jobs for both the student and the employer. And I think I don't think you want either. I actually was quite pleased to see that moderate was where they showed up, because I think there are risks to it being too high. If students feel that they're overwhelmed or that what they've been assigned to is out of their reach, then I think that could be problematic as well. So I think the moderate range is probably where we want to be targeting most, with that idea of, maybe there is a stretch project that the students can be given, that they're working on the side while they've got other projects assigned. I don't know if this is generally everyone's experience, but typically our students, if they reported whether they were overworked or underworked, they typically report that they're underworked, and there is opportunity for them to be working on something else in addition, that maybe doesn't have the same requirements in terms of support and training, but that they can be pursuing as a more flexible project.
Thank you. The next one here is engineering seems like it focuses on more transactional learning outcomes. Do you think that your findings may be similar in disciplines like the humanities, where transformational learning is more prevalent?
That's a great question. So it would be very interesting to look at how this would translate into other disciplines. I have done research in a few other areas, and so while that wasn't the focus of my dissertation, the other case studies, I definitely was playing through those other case studies in my mind as I was doing this research to say, would this model transfer? And generally speaking, I think it would. I mean, it wouldn't be called engineering support tasks, but I think the fact of the matter is that there is typically work that the organization wants and needs to get done, and that's one of the reasons why they're hiring a student. So if you think of that sort of short-term labor supply, but I think the bottom line is it's not a and or. So I would hope to see both transactional and transformational learning opportunities within one experience, and I would hope that would be the case within engineering as well. Certainly listening to the students talk about those highlight projects, that was transformational for them, and in some cases was very transformational for the organization. They were giving dollar figures of how much had been saved as a result of the solution that they were proposing to be implemented.
Thank you. And we'll take the last question before we start wrapping up the hour. Did you examine the hybrid of students and employers' expectation? And maybe they expect different ratios. Our attendee is just sharing their perspective.
So the role of expectations, is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay, so yes, I did get into expectations with them, particularly the students. I wanted to explore what did they expect before they went in to see whether what they experienced was aligned with that and how much that affected their positive or negative experience. And certainly the expectations came up loud and clear on the supervisor's part. In fact, one of the strategies that a supervisor spoke about was in the first couple weeks giving them a few of those engineering support tasks and seeing how they do, to then be able to determine what kinds of ad hoc tasks a student would be able to do. So expectations both in terms of what they'd seen in previous students and what they knew of the program and the level of the student, but then also customizing to the specific student that was on the team and what they deemed that student would be able to do.
Thank you so much, Jadine. We are almost up at the hour, and I see some questions in the chat that we could not get to. The researchers do welcome being reached out to directly if you'd like to follow up with them. I would like to thank everybody who's presented today. For all our attendees, we have recorded the presentations of those speakers who provided consent for sharing with other CEWIL Canada members who were not able to attend. For today's session, it was all of us. The recording will be shared with CEWIL Canada's YouTube channel. It's unlisted. You will receive an email when both the papers that these presentations are based on and the recordings are made available. We look forward to seeing you at our next session, same time, next Thursday. And do have a productive end of week and a beautiful Thanksgiving weekend ahead. Thank you, everybody.